Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Conversation with Conservationists series that we're doing with organizations all around the world that are working to help protect wildlife and habitat everywhere that you can imagine on this planet. Today, we're very pleased to have with us Jacqueline Nelson, the Senior Program Manager of the organization Save Our Shearwaters, located on the beautiful island of Kauai. Hello, Jacqueline, and thank you for joining today.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you again so much for making this happen. So, Jacqueline, first of all, people will be asking, you know, what are shearwaters? Because I was thinking about the first question I would ask you, but if people don't even know what it is that you're saving, it doesn't make
Yeah.
sense. So, what are shearwaters?
Yeah, shearwaters are a type of seabird. So there's a lot of families, different families of seabirds. So these birds belong to a group kind of referred to as tube noses, which means they have little nares in front of their nose and they can dispel salt from them. And so they have like two little holes in front of their bill. But they're a seabird. They're pelagic. There's many different species of shearwaters. So the two that we work with on the island of Kauai are wedge-tailed shearwaters, and the Hawaiian name for those is Uaukani, and newel shearwaters, which the Hawaiian name for those is A'o.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for sharing all of that. So, first of all, then tell us what led to the founding of Save Our Shearwaters and why is it important to protect these birds?
So this program actually started back in 1979. So it's been around for a long time. And it initially was pretty state led. And it was due to the grounding of shearwaters across the island in kind of mass levels. So grounding refers to when a bird ends up in the ground in an urban area where it's not supposed to be and they can't kind of take off again. Normally, it's due to things like light attraction or power line collisions, or a host of other issues as well. And so when the shearwaters typically breed and live in the mountains, the A'o live in the mountain of Kauai. And then when they kind of fly down, if they kind of incur a light attraction issue, they ground and they can't take off again. And so they were getting grounded in hundreds of birds during this time in 1979. And people didn't know what to do with them. So the program was kind of founded to try to rescue these birds that were getting trapped on the ground that otherwise would have died without assistance. And that was kind of what led to the initial founding of the program, was just these birds are falling out of the sky per se, and we don't know how to save them.
Wow.
And then from there, the program kind of developed over the years. I believe it was in the early 2000s, we started to turn into an actual like rehabilitation program in which we were actually providing care, where the initial response in 1979 was to just get all of them back out to sea and bring them to places that they'd be able to take off. Since then, we've developed into taking all native birds. So not only just shearwaters, we take anything that's native in Hawaiian migratory species, and grown into taking care of everything and anything that that needs our help since then, because the need has continued to grow. So as some of our populations have bounced back, like our nene used to have really low numbers, only in like, I think it was like 50 or 60 individuals at one point in like the 1950s. And now we're over, I think it's 3,000 islands across the islands as a whole. And it's incredibly important in the island of Kauai, especially because we are the endangered species capital of the world in Hawaii. So all of our birds, every individual does matter here. So every bird that we can save and bring back from either a car strike, a predator attack, a window collision, is another bird that's out and breeding in the wild in these populations. And so it's incredibly important that we have a program like this on Kauai, and there's another program also on Big Island. And so that way we can rescue these endangered species and try to keep, breeding members of the population out in the wild, but also just the ethical component of having to provide care for an animal that was impacted by humans is another huge reason that we do what we do. Aside from the endangered population kind of aspect of it, it's still an ethical and moral obligation to help these creatures out that were affected by humans.
Okay, so you've given me so many things to think about now. So, first of all, how do people know to bring these animals to your center? And what does their rehabilitation actually look like? Like, what's a day-to-day rehabilitation of of any of the species that you bring in look like?
Yeah, so it really varies depending on the bird you're working with. So the majority of what we work with at Save Our Shearwaters are seabirds and water birds. We only have one native bird of prey. It's the koeo, or the Hawaiian short-eared owl. And so mainly we're working with seabirds and water birds. In regards to shearwaters, their rehabilitation can be very difficult because they're meant to live on open ocean. And so it's hard to kind of replicate that in terms of long-term care and what is needed to treat whatever ailment they have. So we have large conditioning pools that they can go on for hours during the day and swim around if they're healthy, or if they have something that they can still pool with. So maybe they're just thin, they can still pool and go on. But if they have a big open wound, you often can't pool them because the bandage won't stay on in the water. So typically, we kind of come into work every day, and most of our birds get a daily examination. We check their weights, we make sure their temperature is in range, we make sure nothing has popped up overnight, none of their symptoms got worse. We do any bandage changes, we give them their medications, and then typically for like a seabird, we have them on some fluids if they're not pooling, and then we also gavage feed them kind of a fish. We call it a fish slurry, so it's blended fish and vitamins. So a lot of our shearwaters specifically don't self-feed, unlike other kind of birds that you might see in other rehab centers, like pelicans are great self-feeders. Raptors can be great self-feeders too, depending on the species. Our birds don't like to self-feed and care. They're used to diving, especially can dive 150 feet. Can't really replicate their diving, and even if you have the best conditioning pool possible. So we do gavage them a fish slurry twice a day, and then we try to get them as much pool time as we can, so that way they can maintain their plumage and stay nice and healthy. And then if you're working with a water bird, it's a completely different situation. They have different needs, so we can be hand rearing a koloa, which is our native duck here, they're sitting, I think, a population level of like under 1,000 left worldwide. And so we can hand rear those guys. They have a completely different need. They need to be in an incubator if they're young. If they're an adult, they need a smaller pool, more coverage. And they are great self feeders, and they eat mealworms and waterfowl maintenance and other food that's a lot easier for us than having to gavage feed.
Yeah.
But so that it depends on the bird.
Wow. Like your mealworms, do you have like your own tank and you're creating it yourself, or do you go out there and find them?
Yeah, so mealworms you can order online, and unfortunately being in Hawaii, a lot of things are really difficult for us to
Yeah.
get here. And so there can often be one of the greatest struggles with our program in general is just getting things to us. So whether that's like we're building something and we need materials, or we need a very specific food source, it can take a long time. Some things are only available via barge, so it takes like several weeks to boat it all the way from the mainland to us. So it causes a lot of delays. So mealworms are one of those things we try to buy and then maintain a colony ourselves so that we can actually breed them here and maintain it. But sometimes if we have a lot of ducks, they eat our entire supply and then we don't have enough. So we do our best to maintain a colony, so that way we don't have to keep shipping things in. But sometimes our birds out eat what we
Yeah,
have.
I can imagine that. In the end, what is the goal? Is it to make sure that they get released in the wild? And how long do you usually keep most of your intake patients?
Yeah, great question. So, the goal of a wildlife rehabilitation center in general is to release healthy individuals back out into the wild at their full capacity. So, we're trying to get them back into the best shape possible to be able to survive in the wild and completely ensure that they have no other ailment that could risk their survival in the wild. So it's not considered humane to release something that is likely going to starve to death because of an injury or anything like that. So we want to make sure they're in tip top shape. For that, our shearwaters have like a very strict release criteria. So we check their weights, their body condition, their blood work, and their plumage. So they go on the pool for a certain amount of time and make sure that there's no areas where water is seeping through their plumage because they do live on open ocean. And
Mm.
an analogy I like a lot of people use kind of in the rehab spaces. imagine you're swimming with like a scuba suit on and there's a hole in it. And so it will let the cold water seep into the body. And that's usually due to contaminants or wounds. So we check for all of this. So we have a strict waterproofing process that we follow. And they have to kind of pass all of these markers before we consider them releasable. Um, but that is the goal. It's released back to the wild, and to be able to be a contributing member of their population and to be healthy.
And how long do they usually stay in your care?
Oh, yeah. So that also depends. So depends on the bird and the ailment that you're working with. For a shearwater that's grounded kind of during what we refer to as fallout season, which is the time of year from September to December where the young shearwaters are fledging or leaving their burrow for the first time. So they are burrow nesters. And so they kind of grow up in this hole in the ground for several months and then they emerge and start flapping their wings and then they take flight. Um, During that time of year when they take their flight from their burrow out into the open ocean is when they're most susceptible to light attraction, because they're using the light of the moon to navigate and artificial lights on the island confuse them and they circle the light and then ground. And so that's what we mean when we're referring to a grounded bird usually. And so we get about 200 to 300 birds just from September to December that are young shearwaters that are um, grounded for a host of reasons, usually light attraction related, but it can be other reasons as well. And if it's just that, luckily we have a tremendous community on our island that have been doing this for years. And they all know exactly what to do now. They will find a grounded shearwater, they'll call us, and then all of our fire stations on our island are actually drop off stations for birds.
Got it.
And so they'll drop them off, let us know where they found them, give us a call, and then during that time of year specifically, we check those every single day and pick up any birds that are grounded from the night before. If it's just kind of that scenario, it's a very specific scenario I'm talking about, but those birds can recover. Either they can be released the same day because someone found them really quickly and got them to us and they're perfectly healthy and they've only been grounded for a couple hours, or it can take 1 to 2 weeks if they're just like a little thin or dehydrated. But those are usually really quick turnarounds for us because of our community and how great they are at finding them and bringing them quickly. If these birds were ignored and our community wasn't picking them up, they would be in much worse condition by the time they were brought to us. So I kind of speak to the quickness at which we're able to get them back out and health check them is due to our community and how vigilant they are at finding shearwaters during that time of year, and their health because we're not out there collecting them. So, but if we're talking about maybe a nene that got hit by a car that has a more severe fracture, fractures can take often like 3 to 4 weeks to heal, and then you also have physical
Mm.
therapy after that. So that can be like 2 months of work on that bird to try to get them back out. So you kind of usually have a span of it can be a couple days to several months worth of work depending on the severity of their injury. And then if you have a hand-reared bird, something like a Kaloa duckling I was referring to before, those can take up to 2 months of care because you have to wait for them to become fully flighted. So
Got it.
you're caring for those for a certain period of time. But a typical grounded shearwater can turn around within a day to a week if there's no other ailment for them.
Okay. So now the next question that comes to my mind is, all right, so now they've been grounded, you're releasing them. Why would the same thing not happen again?
Oh, excellent question. So the same thing doesn't happen again because actually these birds, as I kind of said at the beginning, are pelagic, meaning they live on open ocean.
Yeah.
So they grow up in the burrow for several months, and then when they emerge and fly off, they're going out to sea for several years. They're not coming back to land. So as soon as they actually make it out to open ocean, they're usually golden. They'll go out there, find their foraging site. And there's been some really interesting research done by other conservation organizations on our island that have studied for the first time, like where A'o go after they leave the island, because a lot of that is still kind of unknown. These birds are really hard to track because they
Wow.
live on open ocean. So there's some, cool research that's come out in the last like even like 5 years of where exactly these birds are going after they leave. But I think the A'o in particular fly off to the southwest of the island, and that's where they're going to go to forage. And they're not going to come back to Kauai for potentially 4 to 5 years until they're gonna breed again. So we're not gonna see them.
Okay.
So it's kind
That's
of
good to know.
you play a long game with these guys.
Good. And do you put trackers on them to kind
So
of figure
we
out?
personally don't put trackers. So we have participated in a satellite tag study with Archipelago Research and Conservation, which is another group here, um, several years back. And that research was released that shows us where the birds went. But we do band every single bird in
Yeah.
our care. So you can have federal bands that you apply that are little metal band that's attached to their leg that has an individualized number. And so we are permitted for banding at Save Our Shearwaters. So every single bird that we release, we put a band on. So that way, if they're ever found again, we know where they came from, how long they were at SOS. You can get all of that information. So that way we just know. So it doesn't track them in real time, but if, should they ever be captured again, we would know who they are and it would get reported to the bird banding laboratory. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
So you've already mentioned, but I want to make sure that people understand this. What are the greatest threats to the
Mm,
shearwaters or what they face today in Hawaii? And how does human activity contribute to those threats?
yeah. In Hawaii, kind of the biggest threats to our shearwaters and native birds, but specifically shearwaters, would be light attraction, especially for fledglings, so the young ones. But they can also get power line strikes. They can get hit by vehicles once they're grounded. And invasive predators are also a huge threat to them. That's just kind of to name a few big ones, but we also have plastic pollution is also another thing that we see affecting our native birds as well. Um, the reason we were kind of founded was kind of around the main light attraction issue and the grounding of shearwaters. And your average person can contribute to that if they have a floodlight on in their backyard during the season. So from September to December, when the young ones are fledging, if they have a large light in their backyard, they might ground a shearwater. I often get calls during the season where they're like, "Oh, this bird just walked onto my lanai," and a lanai is like a porch, is what we refer to as a porch here. And so like the shearwater just walked onto my lanai, and I'm like, "Oh, did you have a light on, like a big light on?" They're like, "How did you know?" And I'm like,
Wow.
he was going for the light. He got a little confused. And so the average person can contribute to that, and also like bigger organizations can that have hotels or restaurants that have a lot of lights near the shorelines, um, are all contributing to it. We're pretty lucky here on Kauai in that light attraction has been known for a long time, and people have been making efforts to reduce their lights. And we have, PSAs that go out of reminding them that
Good.
it's the season, and a lot of hotels will put out pamphlets asking people to close their curtains to try to protect these birds as they make their way out to sea. Um, and then, we have a host of other issues that are, of course, impacting birds, not just, in Hawaii, but also on the mainland, like invasive predators. Our birds in particular, like I said, are burrow nesters. So a lot of people are like, why, well, how are they getting attacked by a pig? How are they getting attacked by a cat? And I'm like, they are a completely defenseless creature in a burrow for several months in the ground. And so they can have no mechanism to fight back to these predators that were introduced into the islands. They're fully at the mercy of the situation. They've developed no defenses.
Mm.
So those can be huge. You can have even an invasive. We have barn owls here on our island that were brought over by humans as well, and those can wipe out a colony of shearwaters that's left, to their own discretion. And so things like that are also can be huge issues that you don't think about all of the time. But unfortunately, at our program, we have to see the impact of those pretty regularly. And it can be very sad when, it's just someone shows up and a whole colony was wiped out by maybe with one cat.
Yeah.
And so just like left unchecked. So that's also a huge issue here in Hawaii.
So speaking of that, then, how does your organization work to educate the public and l- do more around the coexistence with wildlife on the island?
So we run a 24-hour hotline. So anytime there's a wildlife incident in the islands, or on our island, we're responding, and we're able to talk people through the situation. So a lot of times we get calls not only about native birds, but sometimes we get a call about a monk seal, and we're able to tell them, give them the hotline for the monk seal team here. Or there's a honu or a turtle that's flipped over on a beach, and we're able to give the hotline as well for that. And so we're able to kind of educate in that way, but we also try to get out in the community whenever possible. We are a small team, so we don't do it as much as we would like, but we go to, our art nights and have a stand to talk to people and just like open a conversation about, the birds. And a lot of people don't know the story of our native birds. They don't even realize like Nene almost went extinct at one point. They don't know about shearwaters. Sometimes it's surprising being the, people that are working with them every day, that some people in our local community don't even really know about them. And that's because they burrow, the Uaukani burrow along the coastline, but they're not highly visible. And then our a'o nests in the mountains. So the only time you would ever see an a'o is if it's grounded. Otherwise, no one would ever see it in our
Wow.
community because they nest in these remote areas. So you're not really supposed to see them. It's kind of our job to show them to the community and be like, hey, we have this really special bird. Have you heard about it? Or have you heard about the story of the nene? Have you heard about the aleula? Have you heard about these birds before? And get to teach them about it. But we do that usually through tabling at different events or going to schools. And we also do some, like public meetings or like public presentation that we do with the friends group here once a year about fallout, and get to teach the community that way. But a lot of it, honestly, is through phone calls and through individual conversations with people and talking to them.
There are so few of them left. What makes them so special, and why should we continue to save them?
Yeah. I think I think my first head goes to inherently everything has a right to exist. So even if I couldn't name all these really cool facts that I can name about these birds, they're special and they came before us to some extent on the island. And so we have kind of a duty to keep them alive. Um, Shearwaters and seabirds in general are so special to the ecosystem because they do connect the sea to the land and the land to the sea. So they bring nutrients from the ocean up into the tallest mountains of Hawaii, and kind of, we call it, they have guano, which is seabird poop. And they poop and then bring the nutrients into, all of the vegetation up there and allow it to grow and blossom and become the garden island that we have today. When we didn't have seabirds, we wouldn't have that transfer of nutrients from one area to another, in such a beautiful way. And that is like how nature naturally had it in order to let everything blossom the way it does. And then, we have populations on our island that are less than 1,000 individuals for most of our water birds. They're not doing great. And so every individual for them is life or death for the population to some extent. And so if we lose them on our island, we lose them, or lose them in Hawaii, we lose them forever. And people are never going to be able to enjoy the unique species that we have here. And we've already lost so many over the last century, mainly due to human impact. We used to have so many more water bird species than we do now, so many more forest bird species. Currently our forest birds also, I didn't talk a lot about them because we don't see them at Save Our Shearwaters because there's so few. And they live up in the mountains and they're getting ravaged by pox and avian malaria up there. There's even one species, I believe, has one remaining individual left in the entire world, and it's on our island. And our forest bird group is working, to try to save the rest of the other species around it, and they're monitoring that single individual. But it's a crisis, like these birds, we're going to lose them forever if people don't care and are actually invested in, learning about them and advocating for them. It's more than just admiring a bird on the internet or, maybe seeing one and going, oh, that's really beautiful. Like actually dedicating yourself to learning about why they're so special and advocating for groups that are working toward, saving them for generations to come. It is a pretty selfless mission. Like we're trying to save, wildlife for future generations. A'o in particular, our Newell shearwater, the vast majority of them breed only on Hawaii. So if we don't save, their breeding grounds on our island, we will lose them worldwide. There are some found breeding on the other islands, but we hold the vast majority. And so our island in particular has a responsibility to save them here. We also have tremendous water bird populations on our island. We're really lucky in that Hawaii doesn't have the invasive mongoose. And so that has helped
Right.
keep a lot of our populations higher than the other islands. So we were really lucky in that regard from a lot of hard work from a lot of individuals working to keep the mongoose off the island and monitoring and trapping if one comes over on a cruise ship. We have teams that are kind of deployed to try to find the mongoose. And that's so critical. And I think people also don't think about that as, you know, how much work and effort goes into ensuring this is a safe space for these birds. Worldwide, it's not just our island. Um, and the human impact as we kind of keep continuing to reach into other areas of the world and other areas that were previously untouched by humans, we continue to impact all of these creatures on a level that I think sometimes we don't want to think about,
Yeah.
but we have to think
Yes.
about
Yeah.
and how we're affecting them.
And, with so many humans, traveling to Kauai as tourists, I think it's
Mhm.
also important that they're aware of the ethical tourism guidelines,
Mhm.
don't trample on areas that are protected and, stay away from nests and don't have these selfies taken,
Yes.
animals that just want to be left alone and that you could be disturbing and potentially, parent bird species could be leaving their nests unprotected because you as a human are trampling around, these areas and all that. So I
Yeah.
think we have to just look at the footstep that we have on our planet and be more conscious.
We've had kind, well-meaning tourists before kidnap a shearwater chick because it's alone in a little, like, under a log at a beach, which is its burrow, and they
Oh,
are well-meaning, but they don't know the natural history of our birds, and so
ugh,
they can pick up the chick and they'll be like, "I found this baby. It was all alone." I was like, "They're usually alone." And they just don't know. And so I think it's educating about the
yeah.
wildlife around you and also I think one key thing I always tell people who don't know anything about wildlife is, you know, don't touch them or do anything with them until you call a professional. Whether that's me, whether it's the monk seal people, whether it's someone else in my program or another conservation organization, we shouldn't be interacting with wildlife unless we know that it's absolutely necessary in order to rescue them or we're in an emergency situation. Otherwise, we should be trying to leave them alone as much as possible and give them their space. I had honestly a wholesome interaction last night with a dad and his son who found a gosling, a Nene gosling, and he was like, "We don't touch wildlife," like, to his son, and they were, like, very, like, "We don't wanna touch the gosling," and I was like, "This is actually a time that, yes, you can touch the gosling to bring him to me, if
Oh,
it's
yeah.
okay," and I really admired that attitude, like, he was trying to teach his kid, like, "We don't touch wildlife, this is a
Yeah.
wild bird," and called me, to ensure that they were doing the right thing, which I love little stories like that because 'cause I'm like, I was able to tell the father and the son, like, "You guys did the exact right thing,
Yeah.
thank you so much," I really appreciate their efforts.
And hope. It brings hope, right? Next generation and so forth. So that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. So
Yeah.
speaking of hope, are you hopeful about the future of the shearwaters in the wild and what gives you hope or concern, out there?
Yeah. I would say I try to be an optimist. So, I would say I am really hopeful about, our birds, not just shearwaters, but all of our native species. And I'm hopeful because there are a lot of really great people working toward saving them. It's not just my program. It's not even just two other programs. There is so many programs that are working in so many different capacities and at different levels, like advocacy, research, mitigation efforts, in so many ways. I think that being involved in conservation in Hawaii is kind of heartening to see how much work is getting done
Mhm.
and how many people really truly care about the survival of these species. I usually lead with hope because also, like conservation efforts for like our nene, you know, have blossomed. Like we almost lost the nene, and that happens to be one of my personal favorite native birds. And we almost lost them. And because of conservation efforts from our community and from the state, now we're almost we're at capacity where it's almost like maybe we have too many nene in certain areas. And so that's great to see. I've talked to people who have lived here for 20 years and they're like, I used to never see a nene and now I can't go 5 feet in Princeville without seeing a nene. And so hearing stories like that are what really inspire me and give me hope that like, if we can do this with the nene, we can do this with everything else if we really just collectively put our minds to it. And then, there's the support of our community, which is huge. I mean, we wouldn't be able to do anything without the community being, advocates for the birds around them. And so anytime I get a call where someone is like really passionate about the bird that they're trying to rescue, I understand it. I get people who are very emotional that like they just watched a nene get hit and the driver went off. And like that is so, at its core, disheartening to hear. But then you have the other person who's determined to save the bird. And so, you have for the good, you have for every bad part, you have like 10 good parts. And so I think we sometimes get burdened down by only seeing the bad. And I try to hyper focus on the moments that are good.
I think you just said it. I think that's one of the messages that we got to bring to people is that people nowadays, go, well, what's the point? Climate change, everything is so bad. No, the fact that a whole that communities all around the world and in your area in particular are so conscientious and trying to do right. And that's what's going to make the difference. That's really what is changing things, is that there are so many people who do care. And that's the message that we need to bring, is that there is hope out there. So how can people support your work? What can people do? Whether it's a tourist or whether it's the local people who are on your island, what can they do?
Yeah, there's so many things depending on, the avenue of which that people are capable of. So, I think, you know, what comes to my mind really is my mother. She's 70. She can't do hard labor, she can't go out and weed. She can't, you know, do that. But she can, she comes and volunteers whenever she's visiting me to do data work. So you can talk to different organizations. There's so many volunteer opportunities that aren't just um cleaning or doing weeding and the habitats. They have so many different ways and capacities in which you can volunteer. And I always encourage people, people often reach out to me for volunteering. And I'm like, would love if you volunteer with our program if this is like a good fit for you, but also like a lot of our volunteering is cleaning enclosures and maybe you want to go out and to Kilauea Point and volunteer during their weed and watch day. Or you want to volunteer for botulism surveys with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or some of our research organizations sometimes even take volunteers in the field with them to help with data collection. And there's so many capacities in which you could volunteer your time that fits for you. And of course, like maybe you don't have time, you could donate, if you
Yeah.
have, maybe you have the financial means to donate, then donating is fantastic. That supports the organizations directly as well. I don't think any avenue is necessarily better than the other as long as you're doing something. And then even just educating yourself and being an advocate in your community. So if you hear someone maybe like being like, oh, those nene are really annoying, they're all over the place, educate them about why the nene are so cool and why it's actually really special that you actually even get to see them. And so, teaching yourself is also a form of advocacy when you're able to speak out for these things that you care about, and being well informed. So I think there's so many different avenues depending on, what you're capable of at any, given time in your life. Volunteering, donating, or even just advocacy, just, as you're out and about. There's so many ways. And so, it really depends on what you feel is like the way that you can contribute the most, and what you care about. So those were just a few ways. But
I
I mean, if you're a tourist too visiting the islands, like making a day or an afternoon to volunteer with an organization is also huge. There are a lot of events specifically on our island that happen monthly. Like there's even, beach cleanups with Surfrider Foundation that happen on a regular basis that if you're a volunteer or you're visiting are so easy to just step into for an afternoon and help clean up plastic and trash on our local beaches here. And help, reduce, the footprint that you're leaving by helping remove the plastics and trash in other areas as well. So there's just so many ways to get involved. And I think sometimes that is a little bit overwhelming. So I kind of encourage people to think like, what is the thing that you care about the most? And then try to find an avenue to help that in whatever capacity you can. And then, locals that live here, it's all just about like supporting the, even just like legislation, supporting legislation that supports the birds, as well as supporting the individual conservation groups, even vocally or financially or volunteering on a regular basis is huge. And sometimes when you're in this space, sometimes we just need verbal support and just like telling people that they care too. It can be enough for us as well. So those I just named so many ways, but
There's so many.
uh,
You can speak with your vote, you can speak with just helping
yes,
out, or maybe that one day you decide not to have a Starbucks or you not decide to have a coffee and you decide,
yes,
"What? I'm gonna donate," because these are causes. Folks, these are causes that are so important to our planet, and we just wanna remind everyone that we all can do something, and, it doesn't matter whether you're 8 years old or whether you're 80 years old, there's a way for you to make a difference on the planet, and we encourage you to find your way, the way that works for you and all that. So,
yeah.
Jacqueline, I wanna thank you for today. I've learned so much, and I mean, honestly, I can't wait to get back to the island one day and to volunteer with you guys or to
You're
be able to
always welcome.
volunteer again. I wanna give you an opportunity to say the last words here as far as your organization. Is there anything we didn't cover?
I think what I would like everyone to hear is just, if you're interested in wildlife in general or what I'm specifically talking about, native birds in Hawaii, you know, put yourself to it and learn, get out there and something is never too small. I think also sometimes people think if I can't do the biggest thing, why even bother trying? You know, not using a straw, like you said, or, just being a vocal advocate, there's no action that is too small that doesn't have an impact.
For the young kids out there, because I know that we have sometimes a lot of young kids who listen to these interviews. Go out there, do some research, and for the next school project, maybe you can pick the nene, or you can pick one of the other animals from the island, just to get the word out there because it's really important. Every one of these species matters, and the work that Jacqueline and her team and all of the organizations that are on Kauai and around the world that are doing their part. They're doing it for us to make sure that these animals are around for the next generation, and also because they are so important for our environment. Every species matters. Jacqueline, thank you so much for today. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to meeting you in person soon.